Welcome. I'm really pleased that to be able to introduce this morning Dr. Deborah Zarin, who heads up clinicaltrials.gov. For those of you who are students that I see who are here, you hear about clinicaltrials.gov all the time in your courses. Now you're going to meet the person who organizes and makes it better and better. And she's calling it a sausage factory, so we'll find out what really goes on. Deborah Zarin is the director of clinicaltrials.gov in the National Library of Medicine, and in that capacity, she oversees the development and operation of this international registry of clinical trials and other types of studies. And also, it's not just a registry, but it also includes results now, which I'm presuming we'll hear something about. Dr. Zarin has also held positions at AHRQ as the Director of Technology Assessment Program and the Director of the Practice Guidelines Program at the American Psychiatric Association. So in those positions, she's conducted systematic reviews and related analyses and been involved in policy recommendations. In terms of her education, which we're all interested in since we're here in an educational institution, she graduated from Stanford University and Harvard Medical School, and she's a board-certified psychiatrist as well as in child and adolescent psychiatry. So without further ado, Dr. Zarin.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let me find the clicker. Okay, great. I think Kate was in the clinical trials registration business long before I knew it existed, so I feel like I'm coming to the place of all the expertise in this field. So for clarification, the sausage factory refers to the clinical trials enterprise. I don't know what that makes clinicaltrials.gov, maybe the processing plant or something like that, so we'll see. So just in case, I think most of you know a lot about clinicaltrials.gov, but I'll just give real quick background so that we can then get to the more interesting part. So it's a clinical trials registry. The data are self-reported by the sponsor or the principal investigator. Registration occurs at trial inception, or is supposed to occur at trial inception, and it basically includes a summary of the protocol and other things like recruitment information, some administrative information like dates and that kind of thing. Summary results, that's the results database that was just mentioned, would of course occur after trial completion or termination. And in clinicaltrials.gov, a single record, we call it a record in the database, represents a single trial even if it's multi-site. This is important. You'll see data about number of trials in the world, and a lot of the data comes from CenterWatch, which counts each site as a separate trial. So sometimes people will see that and it looks like there's 3 or 4 times the number of trials that we think there really are. Okay, before we post information, we do internal quality review at clinicaltrials.gov, and I'll tell you a little more about that later. And each record gets a unique identifier called an NCT number. The expectation is that records are updated along the trial life cycle. So let's say you're doing a trial, you register at trial inception, and then you have a protocol change, maybe you change your outcome measures, you would change that in theory in clinicaltrials.gov. All changes are tracked on an archive site with a date stamp so the public can see what was changed, but the current record is the most up to date. You're also, of course, things like anticipated enrollment should eventually become actual enrollment. Anticipated completion date should, of course, become actual completion date, that kind of thing. NLM adds other links so that we have the NCT number, we know what the trial's about. We'll add consumer-friendly links to other NLM products like Medline Plus, Genetics Home Reference, things like that. We use MESH and the UMLS to link to other information. We are working with FDA on linking to FDA information. We already link to the generic FDA drugs at FDA or devices at FDA pages. That's not that useful. Eventually, we'll actually link to the page at anything on the public FDA site about any of the interventions in the trial. And we, of course, link when there are publications, we can automatically link to them in Medline using the NCT number, assuming that the journal that published the article used the NCT number. The top journals do that and they're indexed in Medline, but not all journals are doing that. We urge the investigators to tell us about publications, then we can link to that as well. So in the US, there are sort of 2 policies that incentivize people to register. ICMJE, which is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which it has to do with registration. They cover all interventional studies, regardless of the phase, regardless of the sponsor type, of the intervention type. And basically the policy says we won't publish your article about a clinical trial unless you registered prior to enrollment of the first participant. There's no legal ramifications. It's just a practical thing. And as you'll see, it had a big effect on the world. Then there's what we call FDAA, the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act, which is a law that was passed in 2007 in the United States that requires the registration of roughly non-phase 1 drug and device trials done in the U.S. And to clarify, that is whether or not the drug or device is approved. So if you were today going to go study 3 marketed if you were going to do the all-hat study or study 3 marketed antihypertensives, that would come under this provision, and you would have a legal obligation to register it and to report the results after trial completion. And there are specific enforcement, I didn't show the specific enforcement policies, include things like a fine of up to $10,000 per day, withholding of NIH funds. So in theory, there's serious enforcement that could occur. The results database, which was created in response to that law, because basically NLM was told to add a results component, has what we think of as 4 modules. Participant flow, where at a minimum, this is the minimum required on this slide. It's really the consort diagram, but in a tabular form. So it's at a minimum, the number is started and completed each arm, but there's the capacity to put in much more detail, basically anything that you would put in a consort diagram. A module for baseline characteristics, a module for outcome measures. The law says you have to report all primary and secondary outcome measures. So many people think of key secondary outcome measures because that's what the journal editors and then the WHO have said. The law says all secondary outcome measures. And adverse events, 2 tables of adverse events, one for serious adverse events and one for other. And the law told us to organize them by organ system. So this is what's in the results database. And it's the database itself, the results reporting is, the spirit of it is sort of just the facts. There's almost no narrative. The narrative that there is only to explain these things. There are no conclusions, no discussion. So it's really a way to get the basic facts about a study into the public domain in a searchable database. And it's meant to complement, not replace journal articles. Let's see. So this is what some of the tables look like, just to give you a sense. It's just a series of tables, and you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and sort of see some records with them. So in general, our goals of quality assurance are to, and it's much more serious, the results side than the registration side, are to assure an accurate description of study design and to make sure that it's understandable to readers of the medical literature. That was our mindset when we're coming up with quality assurance. We don't know. On the registration side, if you register a study saying you're studying breast cancer and you have 500 women in each arm and you're using this cocktail of drugs in this arm and this other and this, we have no way of knowing if that's true. I mean, we don't know. We don't know if you're studying, we don't know anything. But we try to get you to come through an organizational account so that, in theory, there would be someone at Johns Hopkins who says, yes, I've heard of you. I know they exist and I'm going to sign off on this. And we try to at least make sure that if you're doing it, it makes sense. On the results side, we don't know how many women on each arm died of breast cancer, how many survived, how many had a response. We have no way of knowing that. We don't, not only don't we have the protocol, but we don't obviously have the patient level results. So our whole mindset about quality assurance is to look for logic and internal consistency. And we do that because if it's not logical, then it's not informative, and we would claim it's not responsive to the law and it serves no purpose. And NLM doesn't like to have databases that are useless. And if it's internally inconsistent, it means that both things can't be true. So we don't know what's the truth, but we know that sometimes both things can't be true. So I'll show you some examples. So in terms of complete and meaningful entries, if I was doing a study, I couldn't just say Zarin scale. And in arm 1, they had a score of 2.1 on average, and in arm 2, 3.4, and say nothing else because the argument, that's not informative. So at least I'd have to say The Zarin scale is a pain scale, with 0 being no pain and 4 being excruciating or something. So we make you tell the domain if it's a scale and the best and worst score, so at least someone could interpret that. IOP is intraocular pressure, but it turns out the very first record in the results database we were all proud of, and I ran to show Dr. Lindbergh, who's the head of NLM, and showed him this table, and it was great, and it was a glaucoma study, and IOP was the outcome measure. And he says, "What the hell's IOP?" And I thought, good point. So whenever we find ourselves thinking, well, we assume it's X, Y, and Z, as soon as we have to say we assume, we know it's sort of not good enough. So we look for logic and internal consistency across modules and within a module. So, for example, a time to event measure, really we expect to see a measure of time. That's like literally one of the most common errors that we see. Number of participants must be consistent across modules. I can't tell you how often we get studies where total enrollment is 400 and suddenly they're reporting an outcome measure on 500 people, or the opposite, or they said there were 2 arms, but suddenly there's 3 arms worth of data, or just crazy stuff. Apparent validity. So 624 years we know isn't the mean age of the subjects. Now, if they had said 62.4 years, we wouldn't know if that was true, but we know that it can't be 624. So that's the kind of thing that and I thought these would be tiny opportunities for QA before we started this. And I thought, occasionally we'll see something that we know can't be true. And it turns out there are many opportunities for QA. Just to tell you, this is the boring part, but rulemaking is occurring. So after a law is passed, sometimes you need regulations to interpret and to make it enforceable. And so for this part of FDAA, it was determined that regulations were needed, and that process is called the rulemaking process. The NPRM, which is the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, was supposed to be completed a year or so ago. It's not yet been published. Eventually it will get published, and there will be a public comment period. And it's really important that people like you guys comment, because industry and other organized stakeholders have lawyers all over this process, and they're organized to comment. And it's very important to hear from the other side, because in the end, in terms of final rules, we're going to have to show that we paid attention to comments and how to handle them. And if all the comments come from one side, it's harder to ignore that. And there's a listserv URL here, and I can give Kay the slides so you can have that. And if you sign up for the listserv, you'll make sure to hear when things happen. So scientific role. So the good news is we have a lot of information for people who are interested in what's going on with clinical trials. We have over 117,000 registered trials from over 9,000 sponsors. Fewer than half are done entirely in the U.S. The remainder are either done partly in the U.S. and partly internationally, or entirely internationally. We have over 4,800 posted results from 1,000 sponsors. So the results database, I think, has matured to the point where there's enough in there to actually study, and I'll show you. And it's a unique source of information. So basically, this is a public list of initiated trials, and I told you what's in the things. Let's see. If you're going to, people use clinicaltrials.gov to write articles about the aggregate sort of clinical trials enterprise, et cetera. And it's really important to keep in mind the bottom bullet here, which is that it's not 100% comprehensive. There are other registries. The WHO portal has data from clinicaltrials.gov and many other registries. And it's important to understand how the content of the registry has changed over time as incentives for registration have grown, basically. So if people try to use all 117,000 trials without realizing that until 2 or 3 years ago, it was going to be heavily weighted by certain kinds of studies. So just a few words about the database, the results database and publication. As probably many of you know, there's a lot of non-publication of clinical trials, and even 4+ years. In recent work, we would say that even of NIH-funded trials, we're finding that fewer than 60% are published. No, only 60% are published after several years. And at any given time, we don't track this totally rigorously, but every time we've checked, only about half, sometimes if we waited long enough, 57% of the, no, I'm getting all my percentages backwards, sorry. The last time we checked this, only 43% of the entries in the results database had associated publications that we could find, which means that this is a unique source of information about results for those studies. So studies are being entered as is appropriate, and this just, to me, illustrates the utility of the results database, but there aren't associated publications, and this is the only, you wouldn't have access to the results of those trials if you didn't look there.
One second. What proportion of those that are entered 4+ years ago as initiated give you results at all?
So yesterday, someone sent me an article from Health Affairs. It must have just come out yesterday. Did you already see it? The first author is Law, and they looked at that, and they found it to be fairly small. So that the law, every trial that registers in clinicaltrials.gov is eligible from our point of view to put results in our results database. The law only covers a small percentage of those because it covers certain drug and device trials, and the law only applies if the trial was ongoing when the law was passed, which was September 2007. So we're just getting to the point where there are a lot of studies, but I will just say, I can't say this. I can't say the C word being compliance, but there's a lot of underreporting of results still. And I would refer you to that last article. But, and industry, or at least the top 20 or so drug companies, have done much better than academia. And I don't want to give them total credit for that until I also point out that many of them have not only FDA law to comply with, but they have legal settlements with state attorney generals that many times, and these are public settlements, once they're settled, they're public, that say you have to do this. So they have a gun to their head that's maybe a more frightening gun than just FDA enforcement at this point. So it's not necessarily that industry are all being good doobies, but at any rate, we're getting many more results from industry, and academia has been much slower to get on board, but is now activated.
Just looking through the denominator, I think I heard you say earlier that if you had a multi-center trial, they had 30 centers, that would be 30 trials. No.
Sorry, I said the opposite. Or I should have said the opposite. I hope I said the opposite, but I said center watch. Yeah. I should never do that. Put that idea in your head. So anyway, so that's the, okay. And then finally, journals do not reject based on entering results in the database. So there are saying that you're waiting for a journal publication is not a legally valid excuse for not entering your results in clinicaltrials.gov. Okay, so even though normally you would feel like you can't do that if you want to also get it accepted at the New England Journal, they understand that this is a separate legal obligation. Okay. So clinicaltrials.gov is there. You can use it obviously to find specific trials. Let's say you want to know what studies being done on X, Y, and Z at Hopkins, you could find it. You could track the progress of a specific trial, eventually to results, we hope. Identify all trials for a given thing, and identify investigators and our research centers. Sometimes I use it when people call me, saying they have a child with some very rare condition or something. You can at least find centers of excellence. It's kind of an, and then people are writing all sorts of papers using the aggregate data, and they use it to talk about what I guess Rob Califf and others call the clinical research enterprise. So it's a convenient and the first time ever convenient window on what, at least in this country in general, people are doing in terms of research. And the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative is this public-private partnership between FDA, well, it's run by FDA and people at Duke, and they are maintaining what they say is a more convenient database. It's our data, but our data are freely available for anyone to download anytime. It's just all in the public domain. but they've put it into a relational database that they say makes it easier to do the analyses. Other groups take our data and repackage it and sometimes augment it for a specific community. So out of UCSF, they have this thing called breastcancertrials.org. So they do a regular download of our data, and then they supplement it, and they serve the breast cancer community, et cetera. People have obviously used the data to examine quality and completeness of reporting, and I'll go into that in more detail. So those were all the good news. We have a lot of data. The bad news is we can now see inside what I have called sausage factory. And the first time I used this term, I was unfortunately doing it to a dinner meeting for the Institute of Medicine, and it didn't, well, I don't know if it went well or not, but basically I think of it as that bags of money and a bunch of people enter this building, no one knows what happens, and out comes sausage. And I'm here to tell you, at least from my point of view, it's not that pretty of a picture. So issues. So first, to report results, and these are just ways in which we're seeing inside the sausage factory, you need to be precise. Again, remember, there's very little narrative text. It's a bunch of tables. So this is a cartoon. It says, I used to think correlation implied causation. Then I took a statistics class, and now I don't. The other person says, sounds like the class helped, and the person says, well, maybe. And that level of being precise in your language is what we need in results data entry. And investigators are not used to doing that. And it's maybe that the greater amount of narrative text available in a journal article doesn't require that, but I'll show you some things. So in order to enter results, you have to understand the study design and the plan. You have to have basic understanding of principles of clinical trial conduct, and you have to have access to the data. And we would have thought, for example, that PIs of NIH-funded studies would meet all those criteria, but not really. So these are the kinds of things we get. And it's not just that these occur, and I'll go through some of them, but that if they get bumped up to me, it means there's been 2 or 3 rounds of quality assurance review, ending with my deputy, Becky Williams, and then if the person's still angry, they get them on the phone with me. And it's just amazing what people don't understand. So some things are just not clear, like if you label your outcome measure percentage reduction, we really think good trial practice, it would be to have a neutral name like percent change, because if you call it percent reduction and then you report minus 40%, there's some ambiguity of what was meant by that. We've gotten time to survival twice. And not only have we gotten time to survival, but one of these 2 times, I was on the phone with the person who was screaming that my staff don't know what they're talking about. And I literally had to say to the person, excuse me, sir, what state were they in before they survived? And when I said this to that IOM talk, someone screamed out Pennsylvania, but at any rate, it was just like, but the point is that people, I have this image now of PIs, the principal investigators, just reading off some sheet of paper that a statistician gave them and not thinking. The internal consistencies I talked about, the hours per day of sleep. We get a lot of data mismatch. So just this constant thing that I think maybe covered in 7th or 8th grade science class, which is that the units of measure have to match the measurement. So constantly, so it'll be time to response as the measure, and they'll put in 12 participants, or the opposite, number of participants, and they'll put in 4 hours, or just sloppiness. A lot of structure not making sense. So ambiguity of language, we found that words like frequency, rate, and incidence are used very casually. I figured this is a group that might care about that, but if you say frequency and then the entered value is 33, what does that mean? Similar with rate, incidence. So we try to hold people to being very, very precise so that the data are interpretable, but it seems that they're not used to being held to that level of precision. And by the way, then when I look in journal articles, I can see why there's a lot of mushiness. Percentage, similarly, if people say the unit is percentage, but then they enter 0.75, I mean, it obviously could be 0.75%, but more often than not, what they mean is 75%. And so there's this sort of thing. I wasn't prepared to hear about the structural changes to studies. And literally, arms come and go, participants come and go, and very commonly, what we call the data providers, the person who's put in charge, can't explain the denominator. So here's one. This was a drug company, and they they got, I mean, again, I was like the third level review, and they ended up on the phone with me with their statistical office somewhere in Europe, and their investigators somewhere else, and their corporate regulatory affairs lawyers somewhere else. And they had many problems with the record, and we're going over this table, which was of serious adverse events. And you can see in the first column and the third column, there's a difference of 51% rate of serious adverse events versus 64%. That's a big difference, right? And one is called drug and one drug all. And I said, what's the difference? And they go into this whole explanation that drug all included more people, included blah, 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 blah. And they had this, I said, but the denominators are the same. And then I heard whispering, and then they said, we'll call you back. And that, we didn't hear from them for months. And the thing is, this occurs all the time. And you just wonder which of those rates ended up in the journal article. I mean, and they couldn't tell me who the people, what the denominator was. So this is my Exhibit A. I saw this article in the New England Journal, it might be 2 years ago now, whatever. Anyway, and this is what I do. I look at journal articles online, and I look to see their clinicaltrials.gov entries. And this is a table from the journal article. Looks like 2-arm study, right? But here's the clinicaltrials.gov registration, and there's 4 arms. And if you read the journal article carefully for 4 or 5 times, which I did, you figure out, and this was legitimate, so I can't really criticize the journal article. The journal article was talking about, did it say this? No. But somewhere in it took out of this big study, it was analyzing just data for people with high viral load. Okay? And so it was approximately half the people. This was not a pre-specified analysis, but what happened was, along the way of this study, which was a 4-arm study, and people with every amount of viral load, the DSMB, first they told me halted the study, but really didn't halt the study, changed some of the arms for the people with high viral load. And the New England Journal, the authors and the New England Journal thought it was important enough to get this out because it had clinical care implications for a certain group of people with HIV. But they still had to report results in clinicaltrials.gov, and the legal requirement is that you report results for everyone, not just for certain people, right? And so it was 4 arms, and I ended up on the phone I met Michael Hughes, who was the head of the statistical center that was coordinating these data, and he's a lovely and very, very, very smart person. And he and I spent 9 months, or shall we say he spent 9 months with various people to try to come up. This was one hypothesis of what happened to the arms. But basically, it took a year. And this was just my saying, just tell me where the people went. I mean, this wasn't, people blame clinicaltrials.gov. It's difficult, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, you started a study and just tell me where the people went. And it took them a very long time. And let me tell you, a person who was never in on those conversations and was never deemed relevant to those conversations was the PI who also happened to be the first author of the New England Journal paper. And to me, this was shocking. I mean, this is considered a very high quality group. This was an NIAID, center funded grant. These are top people. Nobody thinks that it gets better than this. And yet this study was so complicated and the DSMB changed it so much that the most simple thing of tell me who the people are and who's in the denominator for your different measures, and they couldn't do it. So that led me to think the whole world's about numerators and denominators. And so what I mean by that is, in general, for medical kinds of things, frequently the numerator I would call the count, the specific outcome measure, the denominator being the analysis population. So here's one example. This is another New England Journal article, but basically this article came down to 3 fractions. It was, virologic response rate in 3 groups. And there was a numerator and denominator of each group. And I started saying, well, what if we can't trust any of those numbers, the numerators or the denominators? So it got me thinking about outcome measures. And Kay and probably many of you have been interested in outcome measures for a long time. So let's see. So why pre-specify? It seems to me it's the foundation of your statistical analyses. That's why you pre-specify. But then there's other reasons why register on a public site. So you can think of many purposes of doing that: to inform potential participants, to provide details to other researchers, and then to monitor integrity of research to see it, right? So there might be those. So in theory, the primary outcome measure, if you look it up in any textbook, is something like the main focus of the study, the basis of the power calculation, all words like that. And but in practice, we see up to 71 primary outcome measures. And in 25% of cases, we see more than 2, and it's not uncommon to see 5 to 10 primary outcome measures. So then you start thinking, what do they mean by primary outcome measure? And, how can that comport with the data? But then, because the law requires all secondary outcome measures, you start looking at those, and we've seen up to 122 secondary outcome measures. So then that raises these other questions. So I feel like there needs to be a definition of a primary outcome measure that makes sense. And then we feel like we need a definition of secondary outcome measure that gives a floor, because there are other, let's call them exploratory measures that occur in a trial that maybe don't need to be reported. And what we're playing around with is a definition, something about if you've pre-specified a statistical analysis, then call that a secondary. But otherwise, we have a category called other pre-specified, which you could voluntarily report, but you don't have to. So the question is, how specified does let's just talk about the primary outcome measure. So if you think about something for anxiety, we get people who try to register just saying anxiety or the specific rating scale or everything all the way up to the most specified proportion of participants with a change of at least 11 points at 12 weeks from baseline on. That's a fully specified. So what is expected? And we created this framework where, the domain is anxiety, the specific measure in this case is the Hamilton. The specific metric might be changed from baseline because, of course, there's also the possibility of doing the end value or the time to event. You could design a study where it's the time to achieve a score of X or something. And then how do you aggregate within the arm? And really, if you don't specify all of these, if you just did this, there's plenty of room for cherry picking of results down there, right? But when you talk to people, nobody really expects that bottom level of specification. And so in our own data, when we did this study, only 13% had that fully specified. And we have trouble requiring it for many reasons, but one reason is that when I try to talk to our QA reviewers and then they come to me with their last 100 outcome measures, you get all sorts of stuff. You get like mother-child interaction at day 3. Is that fully specified? Some things don't have a specific scale. Some things don't have a scale that we know about. So it's very hard to enforce that, and I don't feel like there is scientific backing for us to enforce it at this level. So one thing I'm here today to ask you all to do is please do the research that would show the implications of not doing this. I mean, I feel like there's ways to do that. You could, if you had patient-level data, for example, you could show that changes down here would move things from not only statistically significant to not significant, but actually maybe showing an effect versus not showing an effect. I mean, leaving aside issues of statistical significance. But I think this is a really important thing, and there are many people, many prominent people who believe that it's okay to not specify at this level until after you've seen the blinded data. So there's this belief that you can look at the data that are still blinded and choose your metric. Choose how you're going to report it. And that's a very prevalent belief. And I guess I don't know if that's legitimate or not, but it doesn't seem in keeping with what's written in textbooks. And so I feel like this is an opportunity to this is an important issue. Because all this work on changes of outcome measures, like you guys have done a lot of the work, we've done a little, but these are things we see, time to regression versus progression-free survival, one being a unit of time, one being a unit of participants. Does anyone besides us care? And I think that's, we just constantly see.
So I agree that pre-specification is kind of the ideal, right? But once that flip of the coin happens, things happen in clinical trials that, challenge sort of our best, pre-specification. How is clinicaltrials.gov dynamic in that sense? So take the example with MyQs, right? The DSME got involved, there was a change in the study, and yet you want to know what happened sort of with the original enrolled patients, but there was all this sort of dynamic stuff happening after the flip of the coin. And how does clinicaltrials.gov kind of allow, open to conveying that information in a way?
Well, so, at first, the first point is that we would just urge you to keep updating your record. So let's say you had pre-specified time to progression and now you're changing it to progression-free survival. Go in and change the primary outcome measure. The world can see what date you did it, and they can draw their own conclusions. It's always the person who owns the record can change it. You could change your record from 10 years ago. Yes. And the MyQ study, we weren't in the end asking him to justify the changes. We asked him to convey what the date. Basically, if you're going to present results in tables, which is what we require you to do, we want to know what the numbers in those cells mean. So if there's a denominator, we want to know who the people are. I mean, not literally who the people are, but how many people and which arm they came from. So all we're asking is to convey accurately what happened in the study. And it would be the appropriate role of a journal article to then write up why you think that was a legitimate thing to do. We're not the place to do that as much as the place to just say what this is 4.5 what, and who.
How will you convey in clinicaltrials.gov this whole DSMB, that rationale and all that?
Well, so first of all, there are multiple ways, and actually I could get you to the record and show you what they ended up doing. But when you're doing the participant flow doesn't get reported until results. So now you're at the end of the story. So you sort of don't have to say in results what you thought it was going to look like. You're at the point where you're just saying what it is that you're doing, what happened. So you don't have to explain that it changed. But sometimes we have arms end, and there's a capacity to put in footnotes in the table. And so sometimes people will say DSMB halted this for safety or for lack of efficacy or something. So there is that capacity. Time to event data is another sausage factory thing. Okay, so people are really used to seeing this as survival curves, but we require it for now in a tabular format. And many people pre-specify the primary outcome measure as median time to event, like median time to relapse or something, which is a really problematic pre-specified outcome measure, because what happens if fewer than 50% of the people relapse? Then they just want to say NA and provide zero information for that outcome measure. And we've sort of pushed back saying there is some information, like how many people did relapse, or you might know, a different percentile. You don't have a 50th percentile, but you might have some other percentile. But what's the proper way? And I always remember this comes from the famous CLASS study that was one of the tipping point studies that got the journal editors to require trial registration. Basically, this was reported in JAMA with the 6-month data. This is celecoxib and other nonsteroidals, and this is cumulative probability of getting an ulcer. And this was to show that Celebrex was less likely to cause an ulcer than other nonsteroidals. And these data were published just to the left of here. And at 6 months, it looked really good, and they probably made a lot of money in the ensuing time, right? And the journal editor at that point, Kathy DeAngelis, and the reviewers just thought this was fine. Later, it was uncovered that they had the 12-month data when they submitted this. And you can see by 12 months, it's not only not statistically significant, but celecoxib isn't even the best. And they had pre-specified the 12-month analysis in their protocol. And they didn't tell the journal editor or the reviewers. So this, you envision a group of people looking at these graphs and saying, okay, this is what happened in our study. Which time point should we report? And they chose 6 months, and it worked until it didn't work, until it was uncovered. But so I use this as an example that this was a time to event measure. This was time to ulcer complication. And because sometimes people say time frame isn't important for time to event measures, in terms of pre-specifying the time when you're going to do the analysis. But this is an example where it was really important. And in fact, journals, when you look for them, are full of examples when it is important. But people aren't used to saying, they'll just say time to relapse, and we'll force them to say time frame, which is a legal requirement, and they don't think like that. So that's another interesting area. So those were numerator issues. Now denominator issues. We have many sources of analysis population information in clinicaltrials.gov. We have the total enrollment from the protocol side, and then we have participant flow and the denominators. And so what we found in a study we did of 700 records, a mean of 2.5 different populations per study group. So meaning for arm one, across the primary and secondary outcome measures, how many different denominators did they use? But up to 25. So there are studies that are using 10 or 15 different denominators to report outcome measures for the same arm, for the same group of people. And then we graphed the data. It's a little complicated, but this is percentage of trials, and this is percentage of participants. So basically, about 70% of the trials reported analyzing all of the people, right? But that means 30% didn't. And about 24% of the trials reported analyzing 90% or fewer of the people. So there's a way to study, and this is, of course, an intention to treat versus per protocol issue, but more in a continuous way, is like who's being analyzed and where are the denominators coming from. So in the end, this was a more gruesome thing, but who knows what's in the sausage? And when you read results in a journal article, who knows? We added a new performance test, but learned that the test itself is flawed. Now our product fails our own tests, and our customers are asking to see the test results. Do I have permission to fake the test data? And the person says, I didn't even know data can be real. And that's so threats to validity. I was used to hearing about the commonly discussed issues of study concept design, conduct analysis, conflicts of interest, but I feel like we've uncovered this whole other area of lack of key competencies, something about studies getting too complex, like that Michael Hughes study where it was just too complex. There was no one person who understood the study, and diffusion of responsibility. So we've gone over much of this and much of this. But there are some other great anecdotes, like this was again a PI of an NIH-funded study, reported a p-value, and we have a thing, you have to tell us the test, and he said there was no test. And it's like, trust me, there was a test. The p-value was like, this is the probability of what? So commonly people report confidence intervals and deny that there's a parameter. I mean, this is common. People are reading things off of a SAS output or something, and they do not know what these words mean. They don't know what's going on. So this was a great quote. This isn't right. This isn't even wrong. This is like, apparently this famous physicist used to say this to his brilliant but not quite as brilliant colleagues when they'd say something. So measures of complexity, and I've shown them, but we have studies with up to 10 periods, 16 arms. Factorial design studies get really complicated, and really there is this problem that I think that no one knows what's going on. Okay. So investigators don't seem to consider it their role to actually understand where the numbers come from or what they mean. And yet the statisticians can't always explain or defend the decisions. So it leads me to ask, whose role is it? Like, who is doing this? So, and there was this article that Dave Demetz and Rob Califf wrote, and it really spoke to what I was experiencing, which is a sort of lack of leadership and where have the academics gone. Some of them are here, so that's nice. So issues to think about. This is to whet your appetite to actually do some of this work. We did a summary article that has some of these data, but there's secondary findings looking at the clinical research enterprise. And one of the themes is integrity of trial reporting. But there's another theme, which is Rob Califf and group are analyzing a lot of data looking at differences across specialties. So it turns out that there are a lot of single-arm studies in oncology and many fewer in cardiology. There are a lot of non-randomized studies in oncology. He's finding sample sizes, if you look at the whole clinical research enterprise, that are too small to support the kinds of effect sizes that you can reasonably expect to be wanting to detect for certain kinds of trials. So there's those kinds of trial methods. Are they matching what's needed by the clinical research enterprise? This issue of moving from, there's a lot of time to event data, and there seems to be a time move in terms of, it used to be studies would be done more like counting numbers of events. And there are people who think this is a problem, but it seems very prevalent. Anyway, this is a place where you can easily find things like that. Then I think of the rapid response thing. So in the first wave of news about Avastin, there was the first round of the FDA advisory committee. Basically, they were saying that, it had been approved based on progression-free survival in a study. And this is the wrong quote here because another quote from this thing said, basically, breast cancer studies should not be done without mortality measures. In other words, there should be a hard measure of survival, right? So we looked, it took us 5 minutes, and we just updated it last week. But at this time, there are 948 open studies of breast cancer in our system right now that do not have any mortality or survival measure in them. So there are 382,000 women, in theory, being enrolled in these studies. And so if you watch for these kinds of things, there are a lot of these, rapid response like pronouncements. Studies should never be done that do X, Y, and Z, and yet there are a gazillion studies being done that do X, Y, and Z. Fidelity to protocols, and including these structural changes. Another kind of structural change that I didn't anticipate. Well, again, we'll have this study, 2-arm study with 150 participants in each arm, and suddenly we'll get an outcome measure with a denominator of 400. And I'll say, where'd the extra people come from? Oh, they came from study A307. The studies always have secret protocol numbers. And I'll say, but this is the place to report this study. Oh, but we always plan to include those other participants in this analysis. And we try to maintain this concept that the participant flow and the baseline characteristics aren't just administrative requirements. They're actually designed to help you interpret the results. So we want them to be of the same people that the results are. So you can't just import another 200 people from another study that we don't know anything about and add them to the analysis. But it seems to be common, and this is occurring in industry a lot, common practice. Similarly, they'll say, I'll say, where did arm 3 go? Because they'll leave it out. Oh, we never intended to analyze those data. And it's like, well, what do you mean, what did you tell the people in that study? So this is a common thing that accuracy of results. We had OHSU there were legal requirements for us to do different ways of validating the data. So they came up with 110 matched pairs of results entries and publications. And we came up with a sort of protocol for finding discrepancies, and 81% had at least one discrepancy. 16% were in the primary outcome measure, meaning the name of the measure. But 24%, meaning a quarter of them, had inconsistent data. So when it was the same measure, so it was like number of people with an MI, there was a different number in our system than in the journal article. 24%. So we're looking at those in detail. 29% had a different number of people with a so-called quote-unquote serious adverse event. So these are troubling. It makes you think there's some random, I'm sure it's not randomness, but some sloppiness, I guess, in how things are being reported. And of course, when these things occur, you don't know which is correct. I mean, who knows which is correct, or if either are correct, but they sort of can't both be correct. So final thoughts. I think that registration has become standard practice. At least it's notable when you find a trial that wasn't registered somewhere. That's certainly not true for study results, and we're not there yet. We have a lot of results, and I think they are ripe, as I'm saying, for study. pending rulemaking, we'll consider other issues. The EU, the EMA, has a directive that requires them to create a results database for drug studies with at least one site in the EU. And they are trying to make it as harmonious, I don't know if that's the right word, with ours as possible. But that's something to watch because, of course, that will be a lot of studies. And then ultimately, I was at this IOM meeting. I was in the audience, but basically it was all these industry people and all these academic people using clinicaltrials.gov to make statements about the clinical research enterprise. And they were all, using the data. It was what they were talking about, but all complaining about missing data elements. And yet when they are on the other side having to submit the data, they're the ones, their sponsors, their organizations are the ones that are leaving out the data elements. So I feel like ultimately we're still dependent on the diligence and responsibility of the investigators and sponsors. But I do think sunshine helps, and we need people like you guys to help shine the light. So I'll end there.
I just want to say that was great.
Because
usually people from the Center for Clinical Trials are saying a lot of the things that you're saying, but to hear it from somebody else is so wonderful. So let's open it up for questions. I'm sure there are lots. Go ahead.
So you already mentioned other databases or registries like the EU one that is coming up and the WHO one. The WHO one has been on for quite some time. Is there are there efforts going on to harmonize this with clinicaltrials.gov?
So the WHO is a portal, and it takes in data from a group of registries. So clinicaltrials.gov is, at last look, was 80% of their data. So they take our data, and then they take data from like the ISRCTN in the UK and the Australia, New Zealand, but then about 10 other registries. And they display the data for their 20 required data elements. And they find duplicates and they display them together when they know about them. So that exists. One thing is that they don't, right now you can't download all of the WHO data. So if you wanted to do electronically, so you could and there is some effort to push them towards making it downloadable. So that effort's going on. But there are other issues. Kay and I have been in these discussions for years now, but there's issues of unacknowledged duplicates. So if you're going to register a trial, let's say you did your trial in Thailand and India and China and the US. I don't know, it's a multinational trial, and you registered, or if you registered in all 4 places, you would know that you registered in all 4 places, and you'd probably give each of us the ID number for the other registry, because we all ask for it. And that would be fine, because then computers are good at finding that. But if you registered in clinicaltrials.gov and your Thai colleague registered in Thailand and your Indian colleague registered in India, and you didn't really talk about it, and it turns out that the title is somewhat different. We have examples of actual duplicates where you would never know it was a duplicate because the titles are different, the sponsor, because from your Indian colleague's point of view, the sponsor is the Indian blah, blah, blah. And from your point of view, the sponsor is the VA, and so there's sort of rampant duplicates, and it's very hard. That's the ultimate sausage factory. It's very hard to figure out, extremely time-consuming. So there are still challenges, but the WHO portal does give you a sense of what's out there.
So I was recently on this National Academy panel on missing data in clinical trials. Would it be easy to search the clinicaltrials.gov to look at among the people who initiated, what percentage completed, for a whole ton of trials?
Wait, so that...
So you said that in your data elements you've got the number of people who initiated an arm, right? Mm-hmm. And then I guess when the results are finally, you have sort of percent, that you're completed, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
So I could go in and I could search.
Right. You might need our help to search that. If you wanted to search in the aggregate, I'm not sure that our advanced search page would make that easy, but we could help you figure that out. Yeah, you could call. And that is that cumulative percentage graph that I showed you are those databases.
I thought that was just number of people who.
Okay, that's the number who were reported in the denominator, right?
Percentage who.
Now, by the way, in our QA process, if you have a denominator that doesn't comport with your participant flow, we do ask you to explain that. I mean, you can. Sometimes the denominator, there'll be a footnote saying one person didn't show up for the MRI or something. But yeah.
Yeah, that was a great talk, and I have about 100 questions. Some comments and questions. First of all, I think that you cite several deficiencies. One of them is just routine reporting. It seems to me that linkages with IRBs and sort of mandatory annual updates might be a way to make sure that at least on an annual basis you get an update, even if it's perfunctory. I know that at least at our websites at Hopkins, I don't think it's mandatory, but it's suggested have you registered, but I don't think there's anything afterwards that says have you updated. That might be a way to actually accomplish one of your goals. The second thing is actually more sort of global comment. I think part of the problems actually have to do with the chronic underfunding of studies, particularly at the end of a trial. And I just finished a successful trial, and I actually had no funding, and I'm supposed to, provide databases to NHLBI that are complete, and it's going to be very hard to meet that requirement, which is the sponsor, and then of other requirements that like provide complete data on all the secondary and other outcomes. So I think part of the problem here is really gets at the is a problem related to funding.
On your first point, you all might be aware that there's this ANPRM out about the common rule. Is that there are some people and there are some comments in the public docket that you can see suggesting that it might be good if the common rule required trial registration, which would make it a requirement of IRB approval. And that would make it a legal requirement that's broader than just certain drug and device trials. And I think that would be something worth considering. But public comments along those lines would be very helpful if you want to. On the latter point, I feel like we're obviously not in the extramural funding part of NIH, but I have heard before also from cancer trialists about things they have to report to NCI that are different than this. And I feel like your comment made me think that we should at least sit down with some of the key institutes and say, let's look at everything people have to do at the end of their trial to report to NIH, because I feel like, leaving aside the unfunded mandate thing, the idea that we don't want inconsistent or duplicative reporting in different formats and stuff. So that seems like an important point. Yeah.
So how do you think having the results available is going to affect the process of doing systematic reviews? Should clinicaltrials.gov be considered the gold standard for the results compared to the publication?
Well, first of all, I think that it should be a source that you look at, because again, you're going to find results in here that you're not going to find through PubMed. So certainly in terms of trying to cast a broad net and get results for as many trials as you can, you should go here. Whether it's the gold standard, I think it's hard to say. In a way, I imagine that there are going to be instances where the publication's more accurate than clinicaltrials.gov. There's going to be instances where clinicaltrials.gov is more accurate. Certainly if you will, the list of pre-specified outcome measures and the history of changes is something that might help you to inform your systematic review. But again, that's going to just need more empirical work in terms of, but I can't imagine you get to a point where one is the best source always. Yeah.
I was working with an investigator who was doing a surgical trial. He had two arms, and it started out as a clinical trial, but then he realized he couldn't recruit patients to surgery, so they changed it to a prospective study. Are they still responsible for reporting everything because it was originally in the registry as a clinical trial?
There's, these are the kinds of things that in terms of legal requirements, that's going to be worked out through rulemaking or guidance or whatever. And that's in our category of question of is like, if you were once what's called an applicable clinical trial, are you always, or what if, I would say if there were any participants who were in what would be called an interventional study, meaning that they got an intervention, whether it be surgery or watchful waiting or anything, because as a consequence of the research protocol, then from the legal point of view, I would guess it might be considered an interventional study and you should report it. But it would have to be a case by case kind of thing. So,
well, we're out of time, okay. But maybe you'll be willing to stay around a few minutes. But thank you very much.